It was April 1945, on the outskirts of Kassel, Germany. Smoke curled from the remains of shattered houses, drifting low over streets littered with bricks, glass, and burned-out carts. The war was almost over, but for millions of German civilians the real struggle had only just begun. Food had vanished from stores. Mothers tore pages from old newspapers to wrap scraps of potato peel. Children with hollow cheeks searched through rubble, hoping for something edible, anything. The Wehrmacht was retreating eastward, the Reich collapsing around them. Then one morning, an American supply truck rolled into the ruins, and what it carried would leave an entire family speechless. The convoy came rumbling down a street still cratered from shellfire. Soldiers from the 80th Infantry Division leaned from the sides, rifles slung loosely over their shoulders. They weren't there to fight anymore. They were there to deliver something different. Boxes stacked to the ceiling, each marked with bold black letters. U.S. Army Ration Type K. For German civilians, the sight was almost surreal. Only days earlier, these uniforms had symbolized destruction. Now they carried sustenance. Among the ruins, a thin woman with 3 children stood frozen as the trucks halted beside a shattered bakery. The oldest boy clutched his mother's arm. She whispered, "Bleib here. Stay here." The Americans stepped down, their boots sinking into the soot. One of them, a young corporal from Ohio, opened a crate and began handing out small boxes wrapped in waxed paper. Inside were items no German family had seen in years: biscuits, chocolate, instant coffee, powdered milk. And in one of those boxes was the object that would stun that mother more than any of it, a small tin stamped Spam. To her it was a mystery, a foreign food from a nation untouched by hunger. She held the can as if it were made of silver. All across occupied Germany, scenes like this were unfolding. The Allied armies had begun emergency feeding programs even before the official surrender. In destroyed towns like Aachen, Nuremberg, and Kassel, American field kitchens were turning out thousands of meals each day. Now, it wasn't just military rations. The U.S. Army was distributing something far more plentiful: surplus canned meat, evaporated milk, and prepackaged meals designed to last months. The German people, exhausted and desperate, watched as soldiers in green uniforms prepared food on portable stoves. For many, it was their first hot meal in weeks. The mother watched one of the soldiers use a bayonet to open the can. A soft hiss escaped as he peeled back the lid, releasing a smell so unfamiliar that her children stepped closer in confusion. The pinkish meat glistened in the morning light. The soldier sliced it thin and handed a piece to the youngest girl. She hesitated, then took a bite. The look on her face, pure disbelief, made the corporal smile. The mother's eyes filled with tears. To her, the enemy had fed her child. The story of that can of Spam began far from the rubble of Germany. Years earlier in Minnesota, engineers and food chemists at the Hormel Company had perfected a process that preserved pork shoulder under vacuum-sealed heat. It was cheap, durable, and didn't spoil. When war erupted, the U.S. Army adopted it by the millions of pounds. Soldiers carried it in Europe, Africa, the Pacific. By 1945, Spam had become as common in American rations as ammunition. Its journey from Midwestern factories to war-torn Europe was a triumph of logistics and engineering, a quiet weapon in the fight against starvation. To the Germans, this food seemed almost magical. Their own supply system had collapsed months earlier. Railroad lines were bombed to dust. Grain convoys never arrived. Ration cards promised calories that no longer existed. Many families lived on nettle soup and sawdust bread. When American convoys appeared, the contrast was unbearable. Some refused the food at first out of pride or fear, but hunger was stronger than pride. Slowly, hands reached out. For the occupying soldiers, feeding civilians was not only mercy, it was strategy. Commanders understood that order couldn't return to Germany through force alone. Stability required full stomachs. Food meant control, peace, and a chance to rebuild. Truck after truck crossed the Rhine, each carrying tons of flour, sugar, powdered eggs, and meat. The men who drove them weren't generals or politicians. They were mechanics, cooks, and logisticians, ordinary Americans who had spent years mastering the art of feeding armies. Now they were feeding their former enemies. In Kassel, the corporal who had handed the tin returned the next morning. The mother had washed the empty can and set it on her windowsill, polished like a relic. When he saw it, he laughed softly and offered another. This time she accepted it with both hands. For the first time they exchanged names. She told him her husband had died on the Eastern Front. He told her he'd grown up on a farm. For a brief moment, the war vanished between them, replaced by something simpler, human decency over hunger. Behind these gestures was a vast logistical effort few civilians ever saw. American engineers had rebuilt bridges, cleared roads and reopened rail lines just to deliver food. Portable refrigeration units kept milk from spoiling. Field depots stored tons of canned goods under tarpaulins. Communication officers coordinated convoys with precision that mirrored combat operations. Every meal served to a German civilian was another test of discipline, compassion, and endurance. In many ways, it was the war's final campaign, the battle to restore humanity. As days passed, more families emerged from cellars. Children followed the smell of cooking meat through the streets. Soldiers ladled stew into tin cups, smiling awkwardly as they tried to speak a few German words. Essen, they'd say, pointing to the pot. Food. The mothers nodded, eyes glistening, voices trembling with gratitude and disbelief. Many had been told that Americans would destroy them, not feed them. The propaganda that had painted the enemy as monsters dissolved in the rising steam of an army field kitchen. Still, for the Germans, the shock went deeper than taste or smell. That small can symbolized an unimaginable truth. Their conquerors had more than enough to share. The abundance of America, its factories, its farms, its efficiency, stood in crushing contrast to the ruins of the Reich. The Spam tin became an artifact of defeat and mercy all at once, a paradox preserved in metal. German diaries recovered later spoke of the humiliation and relief bound together in every meal. We had believed the world was starving with us, one woman wrote, but they had food from heaven. In the evenings, as American soldiers packed their trucks, the children gathered to watch. They'd wave, holding up their empty ration boxes as souvenirs. The soldiers would laugh, sometimes tossing them chewing gum or hard candy. It wasn't much, but to those who had lived through endless hunger, it felt like a miracle. Each gesture chipped away at the wall of hatred, built by years of war. Yet behind the kindness was something the German mother could not yet imagine. The food she had just discovered, the strange American meat that her children now loved, was not just charity. It was part of a far larger plan, a hidden network of supply lines, ration formulas, and industrial miracles that had fed millions across continents. It had sustained armies, saved civilians, and shaped the post-war world in ways few could yet understand. Because behind every meal came a question: how could a nation feed the world while fighting a global war? The answer to that question, and the true secret behind America's wartime food revolution, was about to emerge. The secret behind that strange, miraculous food lay thousands of miles away, in the roaring assembly lines of America's industrial heartland. Long before that German mother ever held a can of Spam, engineers, chemists, and factory workers across the United States had been waging a different kind of war, a war of production, preservation, and logistics. They weren't armed with rifles or tanks, but with formulas, conveyor belts, and pressure-sealing machines. Their battlefield was the factory floor, and their weapon was abundance. In 1937, a small-town engineer named Julius Johnson and food technician Kenneth Dano perfected the method that would change wartime nutrition. Working under the Hormel Company in Austin, Minnesota, they discovered that pork shoulder, previously discarded as low-value scrap, could be cooked, sealed, and sterilized in a tin without refrigeration. It was cheap, dense in calories, and astonishingly durable. Once packed, it could survive weeks on a battlefield or months in a cargo hold. The result was an industrial marvel: 12 ounces of meat that defied distance and decay. When war came, that invention would feed millions, from jungle foxholes to bombed-out European cities. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps saw potential beyond imagination. In 1941, contracts were issued to mass-produce the canned meat at an unprecedented scale. Hormel's original plant was joined by dozens of subcontractors: Swift, Armour, Cudahy, and Wilson, all working under round-the-clock shifts. Assembly lines ran 24 hours a day. Women replaced men who had gone to the front. Tin shortages forced engineers to redesign packaging with less metal, while chemists adjusted the brine mixture for flavor stability in heat and humidity. Every solved problem became another step toward victory. By 1943, over 90 million cans were being produced annually. Ships carried them across the Atlantic in insulated holds, each crate stacked by supply officers who measured success not in victories, but in calories delivered. When D-Day arrived, every soldier landing on Omaha Beach carried a small ration pack, biscuits, chocolate, and that same rectangular tin. It became part of the soldier's identity, both loved and cursed. It could be eaten cold, fried, or mixed with powdered eggs. Its nickname spread from the Pacific to Normandy, the meat that won the war. Behind the front lines, the American food system evolved into a weapon of mass coordination. Civilian scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology designed new dehydration methods to preserve milk and vegetables without losing nutrients. The Quartermaster Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago tested hundreds of recipes to maintain morale while reducing weight. Each innovation aimed at one principle: keep the soldier strong and mobile. The logistics officers called it sustained energy delivery. For the Germans, who relied on local foraging and fragile rail systems, such a concept was unthinkable. The Allied advance through France revealed the contrast brutally. As panzer divisions scrambled for fuel and bread, American supply convoys rolled steadily behind their infantry. Each truck carried not only ammunition, but also thousands of pre-packed meals. It was a rhythm of war: eat, move, fight, repeat. German field reports recovered later expressed disbelief at the endless flow of American supplies. "Their soldiers never go hungry," one officer noted bitterly. "Ours can barely find potatoes." Dramatized composite. The miracle wasn't just production, it was distribution. The U.S. Army's Red Ball Express, launched in August 1944, was a logistical feat unmatched in modern warfare. Thousands of trucks driven by primarily African-American soldiers raced from Normandy to the front lines, hauling food, fuel, and ammunition over bombed roads. They ran day and night, engines howling through rain and mud. Without refrigeration, they relied on the resilience of canned and powdered rations. Each delivery was a lifeline. By winter, the system was so efficient that it could supply 500,000 men across 400 miles daily. The Germans, strangled by their own crumbling rail network, could hardly comprehend such mobility. The technology behind SPAM was deceptively simple: heat, pressure, and precision, but its impact stretched far beyond the tin. It represented an entire philosophy of war: industrial foresight. American factories had turned nutrition into a science. Calorie calculations, protein ratios, and shelf-life data were compiled into manuals for every division. The Quartermaster Laboratory even tested how taste affected morale. Soldiers who liked their food fought longer and recovered faster. Engineers redesigned packaging so tins could be opened with a bayonet or mess knife in seconds. These small details, multiplied across millions of meals, became decisive in sustaining offensive operations deep into enemy territory. In the Battle of the Bulge, during the freezing winter of 1944, that philosophy was tested to its limit. German forces launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes, cutting off Allied units and choking their supply lines. Temperatures dropped below zero, snow buried roads and vehicles alike. Yet even surrounded units managed to hold their positions, sustained by the same canned meat and concentrated rations that engineers back home had perfected. Soldiers melted snow for water, mixed powdered soup in helmets, and ate slices of Spam straight from the tin. In Bastogne, medics fed the wounded with crushed rations mixed into broth. It was not gourmet, but it was survival. German prisoners captured during that battle were astonished by the supplies in American camps. They found storage tents filled floor to ceiling with food, cases of meat, chocolate, sugar, and cigarettes. One captured lieutenant, upon seeing the mountain of cans, reportedly muttered, "This is why we cannot win." Dramatized composite. Hunger had become as decisive as artillery. Every calorie shipped from America carried the weight of strategy. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the production lines reached superhuman intensity. By the war's end, over 150 million pounds of Spam had been shipped overseas. In Hawaii, naval engineers created floating kitchens to feed ships in harbor. In England, refrigerated depots stocked supplies for the coming invasion. In the Philippines, Seabees built cold storage units powered by portable generators. The technology of preservation itself had become a weapon, fueling men, machines, and morale alike. But even in triumph, there were unseen costs. Workers in those factories endured endless shifts. Metal shortages forced rationing at home. Families wrote to soldiers complaining that store shelves were empty, while the army ate well. Yet few questioned the purpose. The home front had become one vast kitchen, feeding the arsenal of democracy. Every citizen who canned, packed, or shipped food became part of a chain stretching from Iowa to the Rhine. For the Germans, who by 1945 were reduced to foraging, the contrast was almost spiritual. Their soldiers ate bark bread and horse meat. Civilians boiled wallpaper paste for starch. When American soldiers began sharing their rations, it was as if abundance itself had descended from the sky. They could not imagine how such food survived long voyages without rot or spoilage. Few realized that it was the product of relentless science: steam sterilization at 240 degrees Fahrenheit, vacuum sealing, and nitrogen flushing. These techniques, born in laboratories and perfected in factories, gave America a tool that was invisible, yet unstoppable: time. Time to store. Time to ship. Time to endure. By the time that German mother held her second can, the machine that had produced it was winding down. Victory was near. But the secret was out. Food could be a weapon, silent, efficient, and utterly decisive. In the coming months, as peace returned, the same system that had fed soldiers would now feed civilians. Entire nations would survive on American surplus, and in that transformation, a new kind of power would emerge, not through conquest, but through sustenance, because feeding the defeated would soon prove more complex, more political, and more transformative than feeding armies in battle. That would be the next campaign, and its consequences would reshape the world. By May 1945, the guns had fallen silent, but Germany was starving. Cities lay hollowed by firebombs. Fields had been trampled by tanks, livestock slaughtered, railways shattered. Millions wandered through the wreckage, searching for food that didn't exist. In the first weeks after surrender, the Allied occupation zones became scenes of quiet despair. Lines of civilians standing for hours in cold rain, clutching bowls and ration cards that promised little. Yet in this bleakness, a different kind of army began to march. An army of trucks, engineers, cooks, and administrators carrying not weapons, but food. And with them came the same humble symbol that had stunned a mother and her children: a small tin of American meat. What began as military rationing soon evolved into one of the largest humanitarian operations in history. Under General Lucius D. Clay, the U.S. military government launched emergency feeding programs across the American zone. German factories were still smoldering, transportation crippled, but the Americans had already mapped out routes for relief convoys. Each shipment represented the victory of logistics over chaos. From Antwerp to Bremen, from Le Havre to Frankfurt, ships and trains brought flour, powdered milk, coffee, sugar, and those same pink cans that had sustained soldiers through battle. The objective was no longer to win a war, but to prevent famine from destroying the peace that followed. The psychological impact was immediate. Many Germans had been told that surrender would bring annihilation, that the Allies would let them starve. Instead, the same enemy they had feared now offered bread and meat. Reports from field officers described disbelief turning into gratitude, suspicion into tears. A U.S. Army interpreter wrote that women would clutch our hands as we served soup, unable to speak. For children who had known nothing but rationing and air raids, the taste of sweetened condensed milk or a spoonful of Spam felt almost unreal. In schoolyards, they played Amis und Dosenfleisch, Americans and canned meat, imitating the soldiers who had fed them. Behind these scenes of compassion was a machine of staggering complexity. American engineers restored power plants to run cold storage facilities. Railway units repaired bridges to move supplies inland. Field laboratories tested food safety, ensuring no contamination in water or packaging. In warehouses from Cologne to Stuttgart, German workers, many of them women, repacked U.S. rations under supervision, blending imported goods with whatever local harvests could still be gathered. The same scientific precision that had fueled war was now feeding peace, but food was never just food. It became a political instrument, a tool to rebuild trust and shape ideology. The Americans knew that hunger could turn any population desperate, and desperation could breed rebellion or communism. To prevent that, nourishment became diplomacy. U.S. commanders encouraged community kitchens, where Germans would cook collectively using American supplies. It fostered unity, and it allowed the occupiers to monitor nutrition levels. Sociologists recorded a striking shift. As calorie intake rose, morale followed. Confidence in the future returned one meal at a time. In the ruins of Kassel, the same mother who had first tasted American food now worked in one of those kitchens. Each morning she stirred great pots of stew made from lentils, onions, and sliced spam, serving hundreds of neighbors. Her children helped wash the metal trays. The corporal who had once handed her that first can stopped by occasionally, smiling as he saw her ladling food to others. For both of them, the act meant more than sustenance. It was reconciliation made tangible spoon by spoon. In a Europe shattered by hate, this small gesture mattered more than any speech. Meanwhile, the American home front continued its support. The war industries that had once churned out bombs now turned to food packaging for relief. Canneries that had produced for the army were repurposed to fill aid boxes marked "Gift of the American People." President Truman approved. Shipments under the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Later, private citizens joined through the CARE program, sending packages directly to families across Europe. Each contained coffee, sugar, and the ever-present spam. By then so common, it became synonymous with American generosity. In letters written years later, German recipients would recall those parcels with awe. It was not only food, one wrote, it was the feeling that someone remembered us. For American strategists, this feeding campaign carried strategic weight. The U.S. hoped to stabilize Germany quickly, to counter Soviet influence in the East. Where the Red Army brought fear and requisitions, the Americans brought flour and milk. The contrast was deliberate and effective. In occupied zones, propaganda was replaced by nourishment, ideology by calories. Historians would later call it the diplomacy of the stomach, and it worked. Trust grew faster than any rebuilding plan. A mother might forget a speech, but never the day an enemy fed her child. The impact rippled outward. By 1947, with Europe facing the coldest winter in decades, the American Food Network expanded again, this time as part of the Marshall Plan. Engineers from the U.S. Army Corps worked with German specialists to modernize storage and transport. New refrigeration units arrived in Hamburg and Munich. American scientists taught improved preservation techniques, introducing methods once reserved for the military. Civilian bakeries reopened using imported flour. Within 2 years, daily calorie intake in the western zones had doubled. The symbol of that recovery, ironically, remained the can of spam, a constant reminder of both defeat and salvation. For German children growing up amid ruins, American food became part of memory and identity. Decades later, many recalled their first taste of canned meat or chocolate as the moment they realized the war was truly over. Soldiers who had once been feared were remembered instead for laughter, for sharing, for kindness. That shift in perception helped lay the groundwork for West Germany's alignment with the West. In the hearts of those who had starved, gratitude turned into respect, and respect into alliance. The weapon of mercy had achieved what armies could not: peace built on nourishment. Technically, the legacy of wartime food innovation stretched far beyond Europe. The same preservation technologies that sustained armies became the foundation for post-war consumer convenience. Supermarkets filled with canned goods, instant mixes, and vacuum-packed meals, all descendants of the science perfected for war. Engineers who once designed field rations now worked for companies like General Foods and Kraft, pioneering products that would feed a peacetime world. The lessons of 1940s logistics, efficiency, portability, endurance, became the blueprint for modern supply chains. What had begun as survival had evolved into civilization's new rhythm, the industrial meal. In Kassel, years later, that mother still kept the first empty spam tin on her windowsill. It was dented, its label long faded, but she refused to throw it away. To her, it wasn't just metal. It was the day she learned that compassion could survive even after total war. Her children grew up in a rebuilt Germany, one that traded bullets for bread and found its future in cooperation, not conquest. When asked about the Americans, she would smile softly and say, "They gave us food before they asked for forgiveness." The corporal returned home to Ohio, his war over, but the memory of that family stayed with him. He would later tell his wife that the proudest thing he ever did wasn't in combat, but in handing a can of food to a hungry mother. It wasn't much, he said, but in that moment it meant everything. Dramatized. In the end, the story of America's wartime food was not about taste or technology alone. It was about the transformation of power itself, from destruction to restoration, from fear to trust. In a world scarred by hunger and hate, a simple meal became proof that compassion could be stronger than vengeance. The engineers, workers, and soldiers who made it possible had fed more than bodies. They had fed hope. Because in modern war, victory is not only measured in battles won or enemies defeated. It is measured in lives restored, in hunger conquered, in the quiet dignity of a mother feeding her children again. And in the ruins of 1945, that truth began with something as humble as a tin of meat, an American invention that became a symbol of humanity itself.